The briefing came without a sender. That was the first sign something was wrong. Snake had operated in black sites, off-book extractions, and deniable wet work for long enough to know the difference between classified and erased. This mission was the latter. The file arrived encrypted on a dead channel Foxhound hadn't used since Shadow Moses. No origin stamp, no chain of command, just coordinates, a target, and 4 words typed at the bottom of the transmission. Don't trust the intel. Raccoon City sat in the Arklay Mountains like a secret someone forgot to bury. A mid-sized American town, pharmaceutical money running through its veins, umbrella corporation logos on hospital wings and university endowments and street corner pharmacies. Clean, prosperous, the kind of place that made you comfortable before it made you a statistic. Snake moved through the tree line at 0200, ghillie wrap traded for dark tactical gear, SOCOM holstered at his thigh. The autumn air carried wood smoke and something underneath it, something organic and wrong, like meat left in standing water. He filed it away and kept moving. The Arklay Research Center crouched at the mountain's edge, a brutalist concrete structure half swallowed by pine forest. According to the mission file, it was a pharmaceutical development campus. 40 personnel, light security rotation, keycard access at 3 entry points. A skeleton crew running late-stage trials on a proprietary compound Umbrella hadn't registered with any federal agency. The file also said the last 2 extraction teams had gone quiet within 6 hours of insertion. Snake had read that line 3 times and taken the mission anyway. He breached the eastern maintenance corridor at 0214, cutting the external camera feed with a directional EMP before the lens could sweep back. The door was unlocked, not forced, not propped, just open, like whoever last used it had left in a hurry or hadn't left at all. He moved through the threshold darkness, back to the wall, SOCOM raised, breathing measured and slow. The corridor was empty. Not secured and cleared empty, wrong empty. A coffee mug sat overturned on a security desk, contents dried to a brown stain, days old at minimum. A clipboard lay on the floor with a pen still beside it, as though dropped mid-sentence. The fluorescent light above the desk buzzed at irregular intervals, one tube failing, casting the space in stuttering half-light. Snake crouched beside the clipboard. Sign-in sheet. Last entry dated 6 days ago. Dr. Henry Marlowe, 11:47 p.m. Destination listed as sub-level 3. No sign-out. He rose, checked the corridor in both directions, and moved deeper into the facility. The smell was stronger here, that wet, corrupted undertone layered beneath industrial disinfectant, fighting through it, winning. Snake had smelled battlefields. He had walked through rooms where men had died badly. This was something adjacent to that, something that borrowed the same language but spoke it in a dialect he hadn't encountered before. At the first junction, he found the security station. 3 monitors, feeds from 12 cameras across the facility. He studied them in silence, cataloging each frame with trained efficiency. 11 cameras showed empty corridors, overturned furniture, flickering lights. 1 camera, sub-level 2, showed movement. Not patrol movement, not the purposeful stride of a guard running a route. Something slower. Something that moved like it had forgotten what moving was for. Snake watched the figure on the monitor drag itself through the frame and disappear from view. He clicked the safety off and descended. The stairwell to sub-level 1 smelled like a wound. Snake took the descent slow, heel to toe on each concrete step, SOCOM tracking the darkness below. The overhead emergency lighting had kicked in at some point, red strips along the baseboards, casting everything in the color of stopped clocks and bad decisions. It turned the facility into something else entirely. The pharmaceutical campus had become something older, something that had always been underneath the clean lobbies and the umbrella logos, waiting for the lights to fail. He heard them before he saw them. Not footsteps. Footsteps implied intention. This was dragging, a rhythmic, wet shuffle from somewhere down the east corridor, irregular in its cadence, like a recording of walking played back at the wrong speed. Snake pressed himself into a door-frame alcove, controlled his breathing, and waited. The figure emerged from the far end of the corridor. It had been a man, security uniform still recognizable, name badge still clipped to the chest, Harris, R. But the posture was collapsed forward, the jaw hanging at an angle that anatomy didn't permit in the living. The eyes caught the red emergency light and reflected nothing. No recognition, no threat assessment, no survival instinct running calculations behind the corneas. Just forward momentum, driven by something that had replaced the parts of Harris that used to matter. Snake's training cataloged it in seconds. Compromised motor function, no evidence of conventional injury, no defensive posturing despite the sound of his own carefully controlled exhale in the corridor. The thing that had been Harris R stopped walking, tilted its head at an angle that made something in Snake's chest go quiet and cold. Then it turned toward him. He didn't fire. Gunfire was a conversation starter in a facility this size, an announcement that would draw every unknown variable in the building toward his position simultaneously. Instead, he moved, smooth and fast, pressing deeper into the alcove as Harris lurched past, close enough that Snake could see the gray-black discoloration spreading beneath the skin of the man's neck like a bruise that had learned to grow. It passed without stopping, continued down the corridor, dragged itself around a corner and out of sight. Snake exhaled once, precisely, and kept moving. He found 4 more on sub-level 1, 2 in the laboratory wing, moving in slow, aimless circuits through overturned workstations and shattered specimen jars. 1 in the break room, seated at a table, entirely motionless, head down, and that stillness was somehow worse than the movement. The 4th was pressed against a security door at the end of the main corridor, both palms flat against the reinforced glass, rhythmically pushing without force or frustration or any awareness that the door wasn't opening. None of them were guards running a compromised patrol. None of them were researchers driven to violence by experimental exposure. They were something the mission file had not named and had not prepared him for. And Snake was a professional who understood that unnamed things on a mission were never accidents. Someone had known what was in this facility. Someone had sent him here knowing. He filed that under problems to solve after survival and descended to sub-level 2. The codec signal was bleeding static. Snake ducked into a server room on sub-level 2, wedged the door shut behind him with a chair from an overturned workstation, and opened the channel to Otacon. The connection fought him. Something in the facility's infrastructure was eating transmission bandwidth, chewing through encryption handshakes like interference, but not the random kind. Structured, deliberate. Otacon? You there? 3 seconds of static. Then, Snake, barely. Something's killing the signal on your end. I'm reading a localized jamming pattern, but it's not military grade. It's proprietary. Umbrella's own system. A pause. Keyboard clicks rapid in the background. They're not jamming outside communications. They're jamming internal ones. They didn't want whatever's in that building talking to the outside world. Little late for that. The mission file, Otacon said, and his voice had shifted into the register, Snake associated with Otacon having found something he wished he hadn't. Snake, I've been running the document trail since you inserted. The research file you're extracting, the registry number doesn't match anything in Umbrella's public pharmaceutical pipeline. I cross-referenced with WHO databases, FDA filings, European Medicines Agency. Nothing. It doesn't exist on paper. which means it doesn't exist legally. Which means whatever they're developing down there, they built it entirely off-book. No oversight, no regulatory framework, no ceiling on what they were willing to try. Another pause. Snake, the two previous extraction teams, I pulled their personnel files. Both were private contractors, not government. Both hired through a shell company that traces back to... The signal collapsed into white noise. Snake held the codec open for 10 seconds, waiting for reconnection. Nothing. The jamming had found the frequency and closed it. He was alone with the hum of server towers and the distant sound of something in the corridor that moved the way living things weren't supposed to move. He turned his attention to the servers. If the transmission was compromised, the facility's own network was the next option. He pulled a data cable from his kit, located the server cluster's direct access terminal, and jacked in. The interface was Umbrella standard. He'd been briefed on the architecture, and that at least matched the file. He navigated past 3 layers of credential requirements using the bypass codes from the mission dossier, and the 4th layer stopped him cold. The bypass didn't work. He tried the secondary, the tertiary, each one registered as invalid, as though the codes had been generated for a different system entirely, or generated knowing they'd fail, placed in the mission file by someone who needed Snake inside this building, but didn't need him extracting anything. Don't trust the intel. He sat back from the terminal and let the implications settle. The codes were wrong. The registry file didn't exist. The previous teams were contractors with no government protection. Someone had architected this mission from the ground up, not as an extraction operation, but as something else, an insertion with no designed exit, built for an operative who was supposed to find out what Umbrella was hiding the hard way. From the corridor outside, something dragged itself against the door and kept walking. Snake pulled the data cable and went deeper. It found him in the ventilation system. He'd taken the access shaft above the sub-level 2 laboratory wing as the corridor below became impassable. 4 of the reanimated personnel clustered around a collapsed shelving unit, drawn to something beneath it that Snake didn't stop to identify. The shaft was tight, industrial aluminum, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He moved through it on forearms and knees, sock arm tucked against his chest, the red emergency lighting visible through the vent slats below in thin parallel lines. He heard it before any visual confirmation. Not the dragging shuffle of the things in the corridors, something faster, something that moved with its body against the ceiling of the passage below. He could hear the wrongness of it, the dry, skittering sound of weight distributed across too many contact points. Snake slowed to a stop and pressed himself flat against the shaft floor. Through the vent slat, 3 feet ahead, something moved along the laboratory ceiling below him. The liquor, he had no name for it yet, would not have one until Otacon's files reached him days later, was a perversion of efficient design. No eyes, skin peeled entirely away, musculature exposed and glistening under the emergency lights like an anatomical diagram that had learned to hunt. Its tongue, 4 feet of it, dense and articulated, dragged along the ceiling tiles as it moved, tasting the air, tasting vibration. Snake understood immediately. It was blind, completely, and in that blindness lived the specific evolutionary compensation that made it more dangerous than anything with eyes. It heard everything, felt everything. A single scrape of his knee against the shaft floor would be a dinner bell. He did not move. He controlled his breathing down to the absolute minimum, a technique he'd developed in Alaskan tundra ops, where the sound of exhaled breath in cold air could give a position away at 40 meters. This was different from those missions. Those missions had human enemies who could be reasoned with, predicted, whose training he could reverse engineer in real time. The thing below him ran on different rules entirely, and Snake was doing rapid, silent recalibration, adjusting every assumption his training had built about how a threat moved and what it wanted. It stopped beneath his position, tongue against the ceiling tile directly below the vent slat, tasting the metal, tasting the warmth differential where his body heat had begun to transfer through the aluminum into the air below. 15 seconds, 20. Snake held everything, heartbeat, breath, the microscopic tension in his trigger finger. He was a man who had stared down Metal Gears and walked out the other side, and he understood that survival was not always about firepower or tactical superiority. Sometimes survival was about becoming, for a specific window of time, less real than the darkness around you. The liquor moved on. He gave it 90 seconds before shifting his weight, millimeter by millimeter, and continuing through the shaft. When he finally dropped from the access panel into the sub-level 3 antechamber, his hands were steady, but his understanding of what Umbrella had built here had fundamentally changed. This wasn't a pharmaceutical company that had crossed a line. This was a weapons program that never been anything else. She was alive because she'd stopped being useful. That was how she explained it later, after Snake had cleared the sub-level 3 antechamber and found her barricaded behind an overturned stainless steel examination table in Laboratory C. Dr. Rebecca Sousa, Senior Virologist, Umbrella Research Division, 11 years with the company, and 3 days surviving what the company had made. She was dehydrated, sharp-eyed, and holding a fire extinguisher like she intended to use it. Snake lowered the SOCOM. She didn't lower the extinguisher. "You're not one of theirs," she said. Not a question. She was reading him the way people read things when their survival had recently depended on reading things correctly. "No." "Government?" "Close enough." She set the extinguisher down with the careful deliberateness of someone rationing their energy. "Then you already know this place is finished. Whatever you came to extract, it doesn't matter anymore. Nothing in this building matters except what they're planning to do with what they already took out of it." Snake pulled a chair from the wreckage and sat across from her. Information from a primary source was worth more than any server file, and Sousa had the specific, exhausted clarity of someone who had spent 3 days deciding whether telling the truth was worth the cost. "Talk," he said. She talked. The compound had a formal designation, tyrant virus, T-virus internally, a retroviral mutagenic agent developed across 6 Umbrella facilities simultaneously, compartmentalized so that no single research team understood the complete picture. Sousa's team handled neurosynaptic reanimation, the mechanism by which the virus preserved motor function in non-viable hosts. She used the word hosts without flinching, which told Snake everything about what 11 years inside Umbrella had normalized. "The reanimated personnel upstairs," Snake said. "Accidental release, 6 days ago. Someone on sub-level 1 broke containment protocol. We still don't know if it was negligence or deliberate." Her jaw tightened. Umbrella's crisis response wasn't evacuation, it was lockdown. They sealed the facility from the outside, left us in here. To protect the research, to protect the liability. She pulled a laminated keycard from inside her lab coat and set it on the table between them. Sub-level 4 exists. It's not on any blueprint you were given. It's where they keep the Tyrant program, the next phase. Not the virus, what the virus makes if you give it the right host and the right conditions and enough time. Snake looked at the keycard. How many people know Sub-level 4 exists? Inside this building? Now? She met his eyes. 2. He picked up the keycard. Sousa stood, steadied herself against the examination table, and Snake noted without comment that she'd already put her shoes back on before he arrived. She'd been ready to move, waiting for something that might be worth moving for. He handed her his backup sidearm, a compact USP he'd carried as secondary since the mission file had understated the security rotation by a factor that now seemed almost funny. Check the magazine with practiced efficiency. Another data point about 11 years inside Umbrella. "The thing in the ventilation system," Snake said as they moved toward the sub-level 4 access corridor. "What is it?" "A liquor. T-virus mutation. 3rd generation. Blind." She paused. "But it learns. If it's encountered you once, it's already calibrated to your specific acoustic signature." Snake filed that information in the category of problems that were going to get worse before they got better, and kept walking. Sub-level 4 was where Umbrella kept its ambitions honest. The elevator required Sousa's biometric alongside the keycard, a redundancy Snake noted with professional appreciation for the irony of a company that locked its atrocities behind two-factor authentication. The descent took 40 seconds, long enough for the facility sounds above to fade entirely, replaced by a deep mechanical hum that Snake felt in his back teeth, the sound of climate control systems running at maximum capacity to maintain a specific environmental envelope around something that required careful keeping. The doors opened onto a chamber the size of an aircraft hangar. Specimen tubes lined the walls, floor to ceiling, each one backlit in pale blue, each one containing a shape suspended in amber-tinted solution. Most were incomplete. Malformed torsos, asymmetrical limb development, skulls that had grown in directions biology hadn't intended, failures. The entire left wall was a record of things Umbrella had tried and discarded on the way to whatever stood in the central chamber. The central tube was different, 8 feet in diameter, 12 feet tall, sealed with secondary containment housing that had its own power supply, independent of the facility grid. And inside it, coiled against the base in a posture that suggested dormancy rather than death, was the Tyrant. Snake had faced Metal Gears. He'd stood in the shadow of machines built to end nations. This was not a machine. It was approximately 8 feet of deliberate biological engineering, humanoid in architecture, but scaled and reinforced beyond anything natural selection would have produced. The exposed musculature was dense and asymmetrical, the right arm terminating in a blade-like ossified growth that had replaced the forearm entirely. The face was present, but reduced, features flattened by the same process that had amplified everything else, as though whatever Umbrella had optimized for, it wasn't recognition. T-002, Sousa said quietly. Their most successful iteration, fully viable, fully directive. It can receive and execute mission parameters. From who? Whoever holds the command uplink. She moved to a research terminal along the far wall, fingers already moving across the interface. There's a remote activation system. Umbrella's board can deploy it from outside the facility. She stopped typing. Snake, the uplink is active. Someone outside this building already has command access. He crossed to the terminal in 4 strides. The uplink log showed a connection established 47 minutes ago, 17 minutes before he'd found Sousa. Whoever was on the other end of that signal had known he was in the building, had known he'd reached sub-level 3, and had made a decision. The central containment tube began cycling pressure. "Move," Snake said. Sousa grabbed a hard drive from the terminal, research data, the real kind, the kind that indicted, and they were already at the elevator when the tube seals disengaged behind them with a sound like an exhaled breath. Something vast shifted in the chamber, something that had been given a directive and was now calibrating toward it. The elevator doors closed. Above them, 14 floors of compromised facility separated them from open air. Below them, something that had been engineered specifically for pursuit was learning to walk with fresh intent. Snake looked at the hard drive in Sousa's hand. "What's on it?" She said, "Everything. Client list, delivery contracts, purchase records, government, Snake, plural." The elevator kept climbing, and somewhere in the shaft below them, the Tyrant began to move. The server room, where Snake had first opened the codec, gave up its second secret 40 minutes later. He'd rerouted them through sub-level 2 on the way up,
The elevators stopped at every floor to avoid the clusters on sub-level 1, and the server room represented the only hardline terminal he'd already compromised. If the hard drive Sousa carried was the what, Snake needed the server logs to tell him the how, and specifically the who. Not the client list, not the governments on Umbrella's purchase ledger, but the operational intelligence on him. Someone had built this mission around his insertion. That was not a coincidence he was willing to leave uninvestigated. He jacked the bypass cable into the terminal again and navigated past the failed credential layers into the system's communication archive. Sousa stood at the door, USP raised, listening to the corridor with the focused attention of someone who had learned in 3 days to trust sound over sight. Snake worked fast, pulling access logs, flagging external communications from the 72 hours prior to his mission briefing. He found it in 11 minutes. An encrypted transmission, outbound from Umbrella's corporate intelligence division, addressed to a routing node that Snake recognized, not the full address, but the encryption signature. He had seen that specific signature on internal Foxhound documentation, on mission authorization channels, on the kind of infrastructure that existed inside the black budget architecture of organizations that officially didn't exist. Someone within the American Black Ops community had sold Umbrella his operational profile. Name, field specialization, known infiltration methodologies, psychological assessment, a complete dossier assembled from sources that required classified access to reach. And attached to the dossier in the same transmission was a recommendation that Umbrella allow the insertion to proceed without active resistance, that they let Snake reach sub-level 3, that the natural consequences of the facility's current biological situation would handle termination without creating a government-traceable incident. They hadn't sent him to extract anything. They'd sent him to disappear cleanly inside a facility full of things that left no recoverable evidence. Snake sat back from the terminal and let the shape of it become clear. Someone with access to Foxhound's operational files had decided he was a liability, or had been paid enough to treat him like one, and had architected a mission that used Umbrella's catastrophic containment failure as a disposal mechanism. No bullets, no incident report, just an operative who accepted a classified mission and never came back from it. Don't trust the intel. Whoever had sent that addendum had known and hadn't been able to say more than that. Snake, Sousa's voice was low and controlled. Something's in the corridor. It's not one of the reanimated personnel. He pulled the cable and crossed to the door in silence. Through the narrow gap Sousa had left, the corridor was empty for 30 feet, and then, at the edge of the red emergency light's reach, the tyrant stood motionless. Not the shuffling aimlessness of the infected, directed stillness. The posture of something that had located its target and was making no effort to conceal itself because concealment was not a tool it needed. It turned its flattened face toward the server room door. Whatever external command had activated it, it had been given something more specific than a general directive. It had been given a description. It had been given Snake.
The client list read like an atlas of controlled catastrophe. Snake had 40 seconds while the tyrant navigated the collapsed shelving unit he'd toppled across the corridor. 40 seconds of controlled retreat through the sub-level 2 maintenance passage, Sousa matching his pace exactly, neither of them running because running in a facility full of sound-sensitive mutations was a specific category of fatal mistake. He used 20 of those seconds to scan the hard drive's visible index on Sousa's tablet as they moved. 17 nation-states. Not rogue actors, not non-state paramilitary organizations, governments, health ministries, defense procurement offices, internal security agencies. The T-virus packaged and sold not as a weapon of last resort, but as a controllable instrument of population management, delivered with Umbrella's proprietary inhibitor compound that theoretically maintained a command threshold. theoretically. The Arclay facility existed in part as proof of concept demonstration that the inhibitor worked. The Arclay facility was also proof that it didn't. 3 of the purchase records carried delivery confirmation stamps dated 4 months prior. Whatever Umbrella had sold to those 3 governments was already in their possession, already in some secured location, in some facility that had been told the same things the Arclay researchers had been told, that containment was reliable, that the inhibitor was stable, that the company's proprietary protocols would prevent exactly what had happened here. "The inhibitor," Snake said as they reached the maintenance passage junction. "Does it work?" Sousa didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. In laboratory conditions, with controlled variables and consistent dosing intervals, yes. In field deployment, with the variables that actual operational use would introduce. She stopped at the junction and checked the cross corridor before responding. The stability window is approximately 90 hours. After that, inhibitor degradation begins. After 120, you have what you see upstairs. And Umbrella told their clients the window was indefinite with quarterly resupply contracts. Her voice had the flat tone of someone who had run out of capacity for outrage and was operating on documentation instinct alone. The resupply contracts are the product, Snake. The virus is the delivery mechanism for the contracts. He filed that with everything else and kept moving. The tyrant's footsteps reached the maintenance passage entrance, heavy, deliberate, unhurried, in the way that things without a concept of escape move toward their objectives. Snake assessed the distance to the sub-level 1 stairwell, 60 feet of corridor, 2 junction crosses, 1 bottleneck at the emergency door that would require Sousa's keycard, and 4 seconds of stationary exposure. He looked at the collapsed ventilation access panel in the ceiling above the junction, looked at the corridor length, ran the numbers. "The liquor," he said. "What about it?" "You said it calibrated to my acoustic signature." He holstered the SOCOM and pulled 2 flashbang grenades from his kit. "How specific is the calibration?" Sousa followed the logic in real time, and her expression shifted into something that wasn't quite hope, but was adjacent to the cold practicality that hope sometimes disguised itself as. Specific enough to distinguish between 2 separate signatures, it wouldn't cross-target. But it would respond to the tyrant. She understood. The tyrant is making significant sound in a ventilation system that runs the full length of sub-level 2. Somewhere above them, in the shaft network that connected everything, the liquor was already moving toward the vibration. Snake pulled the pin on the first flashbang and rolled it toward the tyrant's position, not to damage but to add sound, to layer acoustic information into the corridor and drive the liquor's calibration toward the larger, louder target behind them. The collision, when it came, shook the walls. They ran. The stairwell to sub-level 1 bought them 90 seconds. Snake took them 3 at a time, Sousa a half step behind, the sounds of the tyrant and the liquor colliding in the corridor below, reverberating up through the concrete in frequencies that felt less like noise and more like structural complaint. The building itself was registering the fight. He didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury available to people who weren't being hunted in a facility with 1 viable exit and a compromised extraction plan. Sub-level 1 was worse than when he'd descended. The reanimated personnel had redistributed, drawn by sound, by vibration, by whatever sensory apparatus the T-virus had preserved in place of everything else. 7 of them clustered at the base of the stairwell exit, and Snake made the calculation in the space between one step and the next. SOCOM, suppressed, controlled pairs. He took the first 4 before they registered the threat, the suppressor keeping each shot below the threshold that would cascade through the floor. The 5th caught Sousa's arm, not a bite, a collision, the thing's shoulder as it turned, and she hit the wall hard but kept her footing and put 2 rounds from the USP into it at contact range. The 6th and 7th heard the USP. Snake closed the distance on 6 before it could vocalize, CQC takedown, controlled and efficient, the kind of movement that had been drilled into him until it existed below conscious thought. 7 he neutralized against a doorframe with a force that registered somewhere between mercy and necessity. "You're hit," he said to Sousa. "Shoulder, not a bite." She showed him. "Wall impact, bruising, no broken skin. Keep moving." The eastern maintenance corridor stretched ahead. 60 feet to the exit he'd breached at 0214, now feeling like it existed in a different operational lifetime. Snake moved them fast, no longer prioritizing silence over speed. The tyrant's fight with the liquor would resolve eventually, and whatever remained would resume its directive. 40 feet from the exit, the wall to their left collapsed inward. Not the wall, the emergency door set into it, torn from its reinforced frame by something that had resolved its previous engagement faster than Snake's timeline had accounted for. The tyrant filled the door frame, the ossified blade of its right arm dark with the evidence of what the liquor had cost it. One of its legs dragged slightly. Damage, real damage, but damage had not translated to cessation. It fixed its reduced features on Snake with the blank totality of a thing that carried its directive in something deeper than cognition. Sousa broke left, Snake broke right. Standard split, divide the targeting priority, force a choice. The tyrant chose Snake. He ran the last 80 feet with 800 pounds of engineered biology closing the gap behind him, hit the maintenance exit at full speed, and did not stop to disengage the latch cleanly. The door opened outward. He used his momentum as the opening mechanism, and the cold mountain air hit him like a system reset. He turned in the tree line, SOCOM up, and fired, not to kill, not with what he was carrying, but to direct. Every shot to the left side of the tyrant's torso, walking its mass rightward, away from Sousa's exit vector as she cleared the doorway 6 seconds behind him. The tyrant stopped at the facility threshold. It stood in the open doorframe for 11 seconds, mountain air and emergency red light framing it from behind, and then something in its directive architecture registered the perimeter boundary, and it withdrew into the facility. Snake lowered the SOCOM. His hands were steady. They were always steady. That had stopped feeling like a virtue a long time ago.
The extraction vehicle was where it wasn't supposed to be. Snake had memorized 3 fallback coordinates from the mission file. 2 had proven inaccessible given the facility's actual layout, and the third was a logging road 3 kilometers northeast of the Arclay perimeter that he'd flagged as the realistic option before insertion. He'd left nothing at that coordinate. No vehicle, no supply cache, nothing the mission file had promised. What he found instead was a black sedan with government plates parked at the road's edge, engine running, a man in a civilian overcoat leaning against the hood with the patient stillness of someone who had known exactly when to arrive. Snake kept the SOCOM at low ready and covered the last 30 meters of tree line without announcing himself. The man didn't reach for a weapon. "You're 2 hours behind the timeline we projected." "Your timeline had me dying in a sub-level." Snake stopped 10 feet out. "Who are you?" "Someone who sent a warning through a dead channel and couldn't do more than that without surfacing." The man's eyes moved to Sousa, to the hard drive, back to Snake. "The addendum, don't trust the intel, that was me." Snake read him for a long moment. The posture was federal, not military. The decision to be here in person rather than send a cleanup team suggested either genuine risk or a more sophisticated play. He filed both possibilities and kept them open. "The dossier Umbrella received," Snake said. "The Foxhound operational profile. Who sold it?" "That's a longer conversation." The man opened the sedan's rear door. "One we shouldn't have within 3 kilometers of an active biological containment breach." Sousa was already moving toward the vehicle. She had made her calculation. Outside was better than in, and this man's presence meant resources, which meant the hard drive in her hand had somewhere to go. Snake watched her make the pragmatic choice and didn't argue with the logic. He got in. The sedan moved through the pre-dawn mountain dark, Raccoon City's lights visible in the valley below,
ordinary and luminous, full of people who went to sleep last night without any knowledge of what the company whose logo appeared on their hospital's east wing had been building underneath the Arklay forest. That would change. Whether it changed in the right direction depended entirely on what happened to the hard drive and who in the federal apparatus was genuinely trying to surface it versus who was trying to ensure it stayed buried. Snake didn't trust the man in the overcoat. He didn't trust the mission that had delivered him to this moment. He trusted the hard drive, the data, the evidentiary chain that Sousa had assembled with 3 days of surviving inside the proof of concept. 17 governments, Snake said. The man in the overcoat was quiet for 4 seconds. We know about 11. Snake looked out the window at the valley below and said nothing. 6 governments were running inhibitor timelines that somebody in this car hadn't accounted for. 6 facilities somewhere in the world that had been told what the Arklay researchers had been told. 6 90-hour windows, some of which had already opened, some of which were counting down right now in secured rooms that nobody was surveilling. The Arklay Research Center disappeared behind the tree line. Somewhere inside it, in a climate-controlled chamber on sub-level 4, the secondary containment system would eventually fail. Umbrella's board already had a cleanup team en route. He'd read the activation timestamp in the server logs. They would sanitize the evidence, salvage what was salvageable, and the facility would become something that never existed. But the hard drive existed, Sousa existed, and Snake existed, which someone had invested considerable resources into preventing. That someone still had Foxhound access, still had the encryption signature he'd pulled from the server logs, still had every reason to try again with a cleaner methodology now that the Arklay approach had failed. He checked the SOCCOM's magazine in the dark of the back seat. 15 rounds remaining. It was a start. The sedan reached the federal safe house outside Raccoon City at 0531. Sousa spent the first hour transferring the hard drive's contents to 3 separate encrypted servers with 3 separate custodians, a redundancy that was her idea, implemented with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that single points of failure were how evidence disappeared. Snake watched her work and revised his assessment of her upward for the 3rd time since Laboratory C. The man in the overcoat had a name that was probably not his name, and a chain of command that he described in the careful, omissive language of someone managing multiple allegiances simultaneously. Snake had met enough people like that to know that useful and trustworthy were different categories, and that the former didn't require the latter. He sent 1 transmission before the safe house's secure protocols locked down his codec channel. No destination listed. 6 words. The signature. I have it. Coming. Whoever within the Black Ops architecture had sold him to Umbrella was still operational, still credentialed, still holding access to the kind of intelligence that could build another mission like the last one, around another operative, or around Snake himself if the next approach was more careful. Outside, the first light of morning was reaching the Arklay Mountains. Somewhere in those mountains, a facility that officially didn't exist was being systematically erased. Somewhere beyond those mountains, in 17 countries, in secured rooms and Defense Ministry basements, Umbrella's product sat in climate-controlled storage behind the same kind of institutional confidence that had built the Arklay facility and locked its researchers inside it when the inhibitor failed. 90 hours, then 120. Snake field-stripped the SOCOM on the safe house table, cleaned each component with the quiet economy of long practice, and began to think about what came next. May the Force be with you. More stories await.